Hi, everybody, and happy Friday. This is going to be part of our series where I'm going to check in with you every Friday and let you know how the week went in terms of supervised visitations and some of the things that came up and how they were addressed. So, let's talk today about the use of technology during supervised visitations. And when I talk about the use of technology during supervised visitations, what I'm talking about specifically is the use of tracking devices, so locators, listening devices placed on the child, um, recording the visitation from a distance. So perhaps the other parent is sitting within, the vicinity of where the visitation is taking place, and then recording the events, or recording the exchanges of the child. We live in a world now where recording and tracking is incredibly easy, not always detectable or noticeable. And when we put these recording devices on the child, especially an older child, a child that would be old enough to understand what is happening, that puts the child in a difficult position, especially if we add in some sort of a factor where the child is being given a device that would also allow the visitation to be recorded, then the child may feel that they can't participate in a way that allows them to express themselves and bond with the party that they're visiting with. And so when we talk about placing recording devices on children or tracking devices on children, when they go for a supervised access visit, this can be interpreted as interfering with the parenting time or access time that has been granted by the court or agreed to. And that can lead to all sorts of complications for both parties. And it is not something that is meeting the requirement of the visit being in the child's best interest. If you are putting the child in a position of knowing that they are going with the other parent to have time with that parent, and they know that that time with that parent is either going to be recorded or their movements and location are going to be tracked by you, that is going to make the child incredibly uncomfortable. It could create a false sense of fear for the child when it comes to trying to connect and bond with the other parent. And so, if you have reached a point that you feel that it's necessary to engage in putting technology to use to keep your child safe during a supervised access session, that should either be addressed with your counsel and or the supervisor, because supervisors will take their own steps to ensure that the child is safe. So, for example, with our agency, what we do is we create a safety planning envelope in the background that contains information about the child, a recent picture of the child, so that if something happens to the child during a visit, then we can access that safety envelope. It can be given to authorities, and then best steps possible can be taken to protect the child. So think of it this way: when we look at supervised access, the child is in your care and custody. When the child is exchanged, if the supervisor is doing the exchange, then what will happen is the child will be temporarily placed into the supervisor's custody. And then the child will be placed into the custody of the parent that is being supervised, but in their custody under the supervision of the supervisor. So the supervisor is still under an obligation to ensure that the child is being kept safe during the visitation session, but the child is ultimately under the custody of the parent that is being supervised. And when that visitation ends, the child temporarily would go back into the supervisor's custody if they're the one that is monitoring or handling the exchange, and then back into the other parent's custody. And so, because of that particular progression or train of events, it's really important to make sure that the supervisor that you are dealing with has a criminal record check for vulnerable people. Because ultimately, this is a scary situation for everybody involved, including the child. We teach children stranger danger from a very young age, and then this supervision happens. We get an order that says the child must visit with the other party. Maybe there is family violence, cohesive control or coercive control type behavior. Sometimes there is a protection order in place, and now we're saying to the child, everything that you learned about stranger danger, I want you to put it aside. And the supervisor, who is a stranger to you, you need to think of them as though they're not a stranger, because they're the ones that are going to be in charge of keeping you safe. And that can be a lot to get past. And that's usually where I see attempts to use GPS locators and devices to record visits, whether we are, we don't see the recording of video all that much, but more recording of the audio of the visit. So this can be done a number of different ways. Apple products are probably the ones that are most commonly used because they're accessible and they're easy. And so think of Apple iPods right off the top of my head. That's the first one that I can think of. If you have a pair of Apple iPods and they are active, so they're turned on, they don't have to be in your ears, they can be in your pocket. They can be set to translate what they hear onto a cell phone that is within a certain distance of the iPods. And so ideally, when the child is dropped off for supervision, the other party should be leaving the area. They shouldn't be sticking around in the area. There's no reason for that. It is up to the supervisor to keep the child safe. If we stick around in the area, then what will happen or can happen is that the child knows that the parent that has dropped them off to be supervised while being with another parent is still there. And again, interference with the visit. At the end of the day, what the court has said or what's been agreed to is that the child visits with the other party uninterrupted, without interference, under the guidance of a supervisor who is there to keep the child safe and take steps to remove the child from the situation or act if something that is not in the child's best interest is occurring. And so one of the first signs that we see when it comes to recording visitations and access is that the parent dropping the child off doesn't leave the area. And in some cases, the child sees that they don't. They try to reassure the child and say, I'm not going to leave the area. It's okay, you're safe. I'm not going to leave the area. At the end of the day, if they stay in the area and they're trying to use something like Apple iPods to record the visit, that's going to allow for that. So if the supervisor has a rule, guideline, or expectation that you leave the area, then if you're not recording and you're not using a GPS locator to interfere with the visit, you should be leaving the area. That's just what it comes down to. What happens if you don't? And it gets noticed and it gets documented. This is something that I have seen brought up by counsel and successfully argued that the parent dropping the child off to be supervised must leave the area and must not be within, say, 500 meters of the site where the visitation is going to take place. So does it get noticed in every case? Maybe not. But it does get noticed, and I have had it noticed. And I have experienced all three of those things involving a child. And the end result was that the visitation was interfered with, and the child was not able to have a safe, healthy, good experience to try to have time with the parent being supervised and potentially bond with that parent. So the child was negatively affected, and that is something that will still need to be addressed, or may still need to be addressed. What are the consequences if this gets noticed and the supervisor starts to document it? Then we have to deal with an issue of potential bias or perceived bias in the report. Because now when we start to document this, we're making one party look like they're interfering. And it's not that we're intentionally doing that. When we write our reports, we have to write those reports based on what we see, what we hear, what we observe. And if we observe a device on a child, then that has to be documented. And so the wording we sometimes see in an order is that both parties must agree on the supervisor. Well, what happens when the party that is engaging in the interference and using the tracker discovers that it's now being documented, it's now being noticed, they raise their hand and they go, I don't agree with that supervisor anymore. I want a different supervisor, and I'm not going to produce the child for visitation until the supervisor is changed. And in most cases, this is a very successful argument, because as soon as they disagree, then both parties don't agree, and the child doesn't have to be presented until both parties agree. And the other part of this is that supervisors don't talk to each other. So if I was the supervisor and I did notice it and I did document it and I was removed as the supervisor, the new supervisor coming along isn't going to go, oh, I want to talk to that supervisor because she noticed X, Y, Z. And that is actually a good thing, because now what's happening is their version of events isn't going to be tainted, and they're not going to be looking for the tracking devices and the recording devices. And so now if it does get picked up by the other supervisor, that is going to be reinforcing for the courts that now two supervisors have observed this, two supervisors have recorded it, and two supervisors have documented it. And that makes for a stronger argument that maybe the court needs to step in and alter the order or amend the order or change the order to reduce the chances of parental interference in the access visit. And maybe they order them to not put these devices on the child, to stay a certain distance away, and impose a consequence if that behavior doesn't stop. So at the end of the day, I have seen it, I have experienced it, and the outcome for the child was not good. And so we try to record and document each time we see the child. We try to notice if something like that is going on. But I do want to be clear here that this is not something that happens on a regular basis. In my experience, it was one time in probably 20 visits that it occurred to such a point that it was noticed and it was documented in several visits. And so now we take extra steps. We have extra policies in place. And one of those policies is the use of our own body cameras. And so if we suspect or notice that something like GPS tracking, recording, or listening of the visits is occurring, then we can implement our body camera policy. And if the parents do not agree that the body camera can be used during the visit, then we would not support moving forward with any more visits, because that is being done so that there is an undisputable, accurate record